It is well past midnight somewhere in central Ukraine, and a convoy of vehicles is moving without headlights along a stretch of dirt road that does not appear on any civilian map. The men inside have already done something that feels almost unnatural in the modern world. They have surrendered their phones, not silenced them, not switched them to airplane mode, but physically handed them over. Because a single signal pinging off a tower in the wrong place at the wrong time could be the difference between a successful strike deep inside Russia and a Russian missile landing on their position within the hour. This is the reality of Ukraine's long-range drone war, a campaign that has quietly become one of the most consequential and least understood dimensions of the fighting that is now stretched into its 5th year. The account that opened a rare window into this world came from Paul Ronsheimer, a German journalist with Bild, who was given access to a Ukrainian unit operating under the name UV, described as the country's first independent center for unmanned systems. What he documented was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. There were no trenches, no artillery duels, no visible front line. Instead, there was a slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic process of preparation that stretched across hours, culminating in a launch that lasted only minutes. According to his account, the soldiers left the city of Dnipro at midnight, drove roughly an hour along back roads to a house that had been abandoned by its owners long ago, and then transferred into another vehicle that carried them out into open farmland. It was there in the middle of a field under a clear night sky that the drones were prepared for their journey. The machines themselves are built by a Ukrainian manufacturer called Firepoint, and the model in question is known as the FP-1. To understand why this particular aircraft matters, it helps to understand what it is not. It is not one of the small first-person view drones that have become almost synonymous with this war, the kind that soldiers fly directly into a tank or a trench using a headset and a joystick, guided in real time by a human operator watching a video feed. Those drones are essential to the war Ukraine fights along its own front line, but they are short-ranged, fragile, and entirely dependent on a live connection between pilot and aircraft. The FP-1 belongs to a different category altogether. As one of the fighters, using the call sign Phoenix, explained to the visiting journalist, the aircraft functions much like a small civilian airplane. It has its own engine, its own navigation system, and it flies a route that has been programmed into it before it ever leaves the ground. Nobody is steering it with a joystick as it crosses the border and continues on for hundreds of kilometers. It simply flies the mission it was given, the way a commercial airliner follows its flight plan long after the pilots have set the autopilot. That distinction, small as it might sound, is enormous in practical terms. A remotely piloted drone can be jammed, its signal can be intercepted or severed, and the moment that link is broken, the aircraft becomes useless or falls out of the sky. A pre-programmed drone flying on inertial or satellite-assisted navigation is far more resistant to that kind of interference. It does not need a human being sitting at a console feeding it instructions minute by minute for 2,000 kilometers. It needs only to be launched correctly, and then physics, fuel, and software do the rest. According to the unit's commander, this is precisely why the FP-1 is not comparable to the small FPV models used along the contact line. It carries a far larger payload, the airframe itself is larger, and the technology guiding it is considerably more advanced. In effect, Ukraine has built something closer to a low-cost cruise missile than a toy quadcopter, and it has built it cheaply enough, and in large enough numbers, to send fleets of them deep into Russian territory on a near-nightly basis. The distances involved are difficult to grasp without context. Ronsheimer reported that these aircraft can travel as far as 2,000 kilometers in a single mission. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the distance from the western edge of continental Europe to the Ural Mountains. It is not a raid on a border town or a garrison a few dozen kilometers from the front. It is a strike on infrastructure that Russian planners, for most of this war, assumed was simply out of reach, tucked safely behind a buffer of geography that no adversary had ever threatened before. That assumption has now collapsed, and recent strikes bear this out. Ukrainian forces have hit the Gazprom neft refinery in Omsk, in western Siberia, a facility sitting some 2,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, deep enough into the Russian interior that satellite imagery from NASA's fire detection systems picked up the resulting blazes, a strike that far from the front line would have sounded like science fiction only 2 or 3 years ago. Today, it is simply another entry in a long and growing list. What Ronsheimer's report captured so vividly was not the technology alone, but the human choreography around it. The unit commander told him that the hardest part of the entire operation is not the moment of launch. It is everything that happens before it. Planning the route, choosing the field, timing the movement of vehicles, keeping communications dark, avoiding patterns that a Russian reconnaissance drone or a satellite pass might notice. Every one of those steps carries risk, because at any point between leaving the barracks and lifting off from that dark field, the team is vulnerable to exactly the kind of strike they themselves specialize in delivering. If Russian intelligence discovered even a fragment of the plan, A missile or a loitering munition could turn that quiet Ukrainian field into a target within minutes. The soldiers know this. It is why the phones are surrendered before they even begin the drive. It is why they choose routes along back roads instead of highways. It is why an abandoned house becomes a waypoint rather than a destination, a place to switch vehicles and disappear a little further into the anonymity of the countryside. Ukraine, the report noted, is a large country, and that size is itself a form of protection, allowing units to disperse and vanish into rural landscapes that no single reconnaissance pass can fully cover. When the moment finally comes, it is almost anticlimactic in its simplicity, at least from the outside. The soldiers arm each drone with its explosive payload, complete the final checks, and then step back. There is no elaborate launch pad, no roar of an airfield. Ronsheimer described the aircraft lifting off one after another and disappearing into the night sky in a matter of minutes, quietly climbing toward the horizon and toward Russia. He noted his own surprise that Russian reconnaissance assets had not detected them, a detail that speaks volumes about the current state of the technological contest between Ukrainian ingenuity and Russian air defense. By the following morning, Russian state media was already reporting fresh strikes on oil refineries, the fires and disruptions serving as confirmation from the other side of what had happened in that dark field only hours before. That single night, multiplied many times over, is the engine behind a campaign that has quietly reshaped the economics and the psychology of this war. It is worth stepping back from the specific mission Ronsheimer witnessed and looking at the wider pattern, because the scale of what Ukraine has built over the past year is genuinely staggering. According to analysis reported by the Financial Times, drawing on data compiled by the Polish research group Rochan Consulting, Ukrainian forces struck Russian oil refineries at least 194 times in the first 6 months of this year alone. That figure represents an 11-fold increase compared with the same period the year before. May alone saw a record 16 confirmed refinery strikes. This is not a sporadic harassment campaign. It is a sustained, systematic, months-long operation. Reportedly authorized as a 40-day strategic initiative approved at the presidential level and carried out with the involvement of Ukraine's domestic security services, aimed squarely at military facilities, defense industrial sites, logistics corridors, and energy infrastructure that keeps the Russian war machine supplied and funded. The scope of the target list is worth dwelling on. Analysts tracking the campaign, including reporting drawn from the independent outlet Meduza, have noted that by the end of May, not a single major refinery in the European portion of Russia had escaped a Ukrainian strike. Facilities in Moscow itself, in Yaroslavl and Volgograd, in Samara, in Nizhnekamsk, and Krasnodar have all been hit, some of them repeatedly. The Moscow refinery in the Kapotnya district, struck in June, produced viral footage of a storage tank lid being hurled into the air by the force of the explosion. A single image that did more to communicate the reach of Ukraine's capability than any official statement could. Only 2 of Russia's 10 largest refineries had, as of recent reporting, avoided being struck at all, and both of those sit east of the Ural Mountains, in Omsk and in Irkutsk, geography that until recently offered something close to genuine safety. The Omsk facility, the largest refinery in the entire country, was finally hit in early July, closing off one of the last remaining sanctuaries. The consequences inside Russia have moved well beyond the symbolic. Ukrainian security officials have stated that close to 40% of Russian refining capacity has been rendered idle at various points because of this campaign, a figure that, if accurate, represents a serious blow to a sector that underwrites much of the Kremlin's war financing. Fuel shortages have appeared not only near the front, but in places as distant and ordinary as Siberian towns, thousands of kilometers from any battlefield, with reports of rationing at filling stations and long queues becoming a recurring feature of daily life in parts of the country. The International Energy Agency, in its own market analysis, has projected that the drag on Russian refinery throughput from these strikes will persist for an extended period, a striking acknowledgement from a body that normally concerns itself with global supply and demand curves rather than the tactical details of a regional war. When an organization like the IEA begins factoring drone strikes into its monthly oil market forecasts, it is a signal that the campaign has crossed from a military curiosity into a genuine macroeconomic variable. It is worth pausing here to place this campaign in a broader historical frame, because what Ukraine is doing echoes, in some ways, one of the oldest ideas in the theory of air power, even as it is executed with entirely new tools. Strategic bombing theorists in the early and middle 20th century argued that a war's outcome could be shaped not only by defeating an enemy's army in the field, but by attacking the industrial and logistical foundation that sustains that army, its factories, its fuel supply, its transportation network. Oil, in particular, has long been recognized as one of the most sensitive pressure points in any modern war effort, because everything from a tank to a fighter jet to a supply truck is useless without it. Allied bombing campaigns against German synthetic fuel plants in the final years of the Second World War are still studied today as a case where sustained pressure on fuel production measurably degraded an adversary's ability to fight, even while other parts of that adversary's economy continued to function. Ukraine's campaign against Russian refineries follows a similar logic, but it does so without a single manned bomber, without risking a single pilot, and at a fraction of the cost of a traditional air campaign. A drone like the FP-1 costs a tiny fraction of what a cruise missile or a manned strike aircraft would cost to build and operate, and even if a significant percentage of any given wave is intercepted or fails to reach its target, the economics still favor the attacker. Russia is forced to spend enormously on air defense systems, on radar coverage across an almost incomprehensibly large territory, and on repairing or replacing refining infrastructure that can take months to rebuild, all in response to aircraft that individually cost a small fraction of the interceptor missiles fired at them. This asymmetry is central to why so many defense analysts now describe Ukraine's long-range drone program as one of the most important developments of the entire war, arguably rivaling or exceeding the significance of any single battlefield offensive. It has not been enough on its own to force a Russian withdrawal or to end the fighting, and few serious analysts claim that it will, but it has done something quieter and, in the long run, potentially more corrosive. It has demonstrated to the Russian population, in a way that frontline casualty reports rarely can, that the war has a cost that reaches into ordinary daily life in the form of a fuel shortage at a local station or a plume of black smoke visible from a nearby town. It has forced the Russian military to divert air defense assets away from the front line and toward the protection of economic infrastructure spread across an enormous landmass, a task that is, in practical terms, nearly impossible to accomplish completely. And it has generated a slow, grinding drain on the very revenue stream, oil exports and refined fuel sales, that finances the broader war effort. None of this has occurred without controversy or risk, and it is worth being honest about both. Deep strikes into Russian territory raise the perennial question of escalation. For much of the war, Ukraine's Western partners, and particularly the United States under different administrations, expressed varying degrees of discomfort with long-range strikes conducted using Western-supplied weapons or intelligence, worried that hitting targets deep inside Russia could provoke a wider or more dangerous response from Moscow, potentially drawing NATO more directly into the conflict. What has changed the calculus, at least in part, is that these particular drones are Ukrainian-made. President Volodymyr Zelensky has emphasized publicly that Ukraine now produces a substantial and growing share of the weaponry it uses, including at the front line, reducing the country's dependence on foreign approval for how and where those weapons are used. A domestically manufactured drone, launched from a Ukrainian field by Ukrainian soldiers under Ukrainian command, does not carry the same diplomatic entanglements as a Western-provided missile system. That independence has given Kyiv a freer hand to expand the campaign on its own terms, even as some Western officials continue to voice concern, publicly and privately, about where the escalatory ladder ultimately leads. There is also a NATO dimension to this story that extends well beyond Ukraine's own borders. The success and audacity of these strikes have prompted a broader reassessment within the alliance of how vulnerable large fixed infrastructure, of exactly the kind found on NATO territory as well, might be to a similar kind of low-cost, long-range drone saturation attack. Reports have emerged of European governments accelerating investment in counter-drone systems, some estimates for a coordinated continental counter-drone initiative running into the tens of billions of dollars, a direct response to the recognition that if Ukraine can build and fly aircraft capable of reaching 2,000 kilometers into hostile territory on a limited industrial base forged under wartime pressure, then similar or more sophisticated systems could eventually be built, bought, or deployed by other actors against other targets. In that sense, the quiet field outside Dnipro that Ronsheimer visited has implications that stretch well beyond the war it was built to fight. It is easy, when discussing systems and statistics and strategic theory, to lose sight of the individual soldiers standing in that dark field, and that would be a mistake, because the human dimension of this story is at least as important as the technical one. These are not distant operators sitting in an air-conditioned control room hundreds of kilometers from any danger. They travel by night on unmarked roads, specifically because they know that discovery means death, not abstractly but immediately, in the form of a strike on their own position before their own drones have even reached their targets. The decision to hand over a phone before a mission is not a minor inconvenience. It is an acknowledgement that a piece of everyday technology, something that connects a soldier to family, to news, to the ordinary rhythms of life, has become a liability serious enough to be surrendered entirely for the duration of an operation. It reflects a level of discipline and a level of fear that few outside the unit will ever fully understand. The commander's explanation to Ronsheimer of why Ukraine currently holds an edge in this particular technological contest is worth sitting with, not because it is a neutral technical assessment, but because it captures something about the motivation driving this entire program. He framed Ukraine's advantage not primarily in terms of engineering superiority, but in terms of necessity and legitimacy, arguing that fighting in defense of one's own country and one's own freedom leaves no option but excellence. Whatever one makes of that framing, it is undeniable that Ukraine's drone industry has developed at a pace that has surprised even seasoned defense analysts, moving from small improvised first-person view drones early in the war to increasingly sophisticated long-range platforms like the FP1, developed and iterated under the pressure of continuous combat feedback, a process that, in peacetime, might take a decade, compressed instead into a couple of years. Engineers, private companies, and military units have reportedly worked in tight, fast-moving loops, adjusting designs based on what works and what fails on actual missions, a level of iteration speed that traditional defense procurement, bound by longer bureaucratic cycles, would struggle to match. That speed has real consequences on the other side of the border as well. Russian officials have publicly insisted, repeatedly, that their air defenses intercept the overwhelming majority of Ukrainian drones sent against them, releasing figures claiming tens of thousands of intercepted aircraft over the course of this year alone. There is likely truth in the claim that many drones are shot down or fail to reach their targets, because Russia has invested heavily in layered air defense and electronic warfare. But the refinery fires, the satellite imagery, the fuel shortages, and the independent economic analysis of refining capacity all point to a simple and uncomfortable fact for Moscow. Even an imperfect interception rate is not the same as an effective defense when the attacker only needs a fraction of a large wave to get through in order to inflict meaningful damage. A campaign that hits its targets on even a modest percentage of attempts, sustained night after night, week after week, accumulates damage faster than facilities as complex and difficult to repair as oil refineries can be restored. Analysts studying the economic impact urge some caution against overstating the immediate effect. The Carnegie Endowment, in a review of the campaign, noted that Ukrainian drones have repeatedly struck a set of major Russian refineries, representing a substantial share, close to 2/5, of the country's nominal refining capacity, but cautioned that the practical damage, while serious, has not yet been crippling in the sense of ending Russia's ability to fuel its military or sustain its broader economy. Refineries can often resume partial operations relatively quickly after a strike. Spare processing capacity elsewhere can sometimes be redirected, and Russia retains substantial reserves and alternative supply arrangements. In other words, this is not, by itself, a knockout blow, but that framing somewhat understates the cumulative and compounding nature of what is happening. A single strike on a single facility might be absorbed. A sustained campaign, hitting dozens of facilities repeatedly across an entire 6-month stretch, forces a much harder set of trade-offs. Constant repair spending, diverted air defense resources, reduced export revenue, and a steady erosion of the assumption that any part of Russian territory, no matter how distant from the front, is inherently safe. That erosion of a sense of safety may, in the end, be the most significant strategic effect of all, more significant even than the direct economic damage. For most of the war's first 2 or 3 years, the overwhelming majority of Russian civilians experienced the conflict only through television broadcasts and official statements, a war happening somewhere else, to someone else, with only the occasional and geographically limited exception. The extension of Ukraine's reach to 2,000 kilometers deep into Siberia changes that equation for an entirely different segment of the Russian population, people who live nowhere near any border and who had every reason to believe the war would never touch their daily routine. A fuel shortage at a local station, caused by a strike on a refinery they may never have heard of before it made local news, is a small but real intrusion of the war into an otherwise insulated life. Multiplied across dozens of regions and hundreds of strikes, that intrusion becomes a form of pressure that is difficult to quantify in economic terms, but that political leaders, including those in the Kremlin, cannot simply ignore indefinitely. None of this suggests that the war is nearing any kind of swift conclusion, and it would be irresponsible to frame it that way. Ground fighting along the Eastern Front continues to grind forward with agonizing slowness and enormous human cost on both sides, and no single campaign, however innovative, has proven capable of ending that grinding contest on its own. What the long-range drone campaign does represent is a genuine shift in how this war is being fought, and, arguably, in how future wars between technologically capable but resource-constrained adversaries might be fought as well. It is a campaign built not around expensive, exquisite weapon systems produced in small numbers over long timelines, but around cheaper, simpler, more numerous platforms that can be built quickly, iterated rapidly, and launched in volumes large enough to overwhelm even a well-resourced air defense network operating across a vast territory. It is a campaign that trades the risk to a pilot's life for the risk to a small ground crew operating deep behind their own lines, in secrecy, under constant threat of discovery, And it is a campaign whose ultimate significance may only become fully clear years from now, when historians and defense planners look back at this period as the moment when long-range unmanned strike capability moved from an experimental curiosity to a central pillar of how a determined but materially disadvantaged nation can impose real and sustained costs on a far larger adversary. For now, the story remains as what Ronsheimer captured on that single night outside Dnipro: a small group of soldiers, cut off from the outside world by their own choice, moving through darkness along roads that do not appear on any map, preparing aircraft that look almost unassuming on the ground, but that carry the accumulated weight of years of wartime innovation. Aircraft that will, within hours, be burning somewhere deep inside Russia, and that will, by morning, be confirmed not by Ukrainian officials, but by Russian state media itself, reporting on fires it cannot fully explain away. It is a strange, quiet, almost bureaucratic form of warfare, conducted in silence and secrecy, its effects measured not in captured territory, but in barrels of unrefined crude, in queues at gas stations thousands of kilometers from any front line, and in the slow, steady realization inside Russia that no distance, however great, guarantees safety anymore. That realization, more than any single explosion, may prove to be the most lasting legacy of what happens every night in fields like the one that journalist was allowed briefly to see. There is a temptation, when a story like this circulates, to treat it as a piece of military trivia, an interesting footnote about a new kind of drone with an unusually long range. That temptation should be resisted, because underneath the specific details of the FP1 and the specific unit that operates it lies a much larger transformation in how a technologically capable but resource-limited state can contest a much larger power. For decades, the ability to strike deep into an adversary's homeland was treated as the exclusive privilege of major powers, nations wealthy enough to build long-range bombers, submarine-launched missiles, or expensive precision-guided cruise missiles produced in limited numbers at enormous cost. What Ukraine has demonstrated, out of necessity rather than choice, is that this exclusivity was never a law of physics. It was a function of cost and industrial access, and both of those constraints can be worked around by a country with enough engineering talent, enough desperation, and enough willingness to iterate quickly under pressure. Consider the manufacturing side of this story for a moment, because it is arguably as remarkable as the missions themselves. Firepoint, the company behind the FP1, is one of a growing number of private and quasi-private Ukrainian drone manufacturers that have emerged almost entirely during the course of this war, many of them founded by engineers, hobbyists, and entrepreneurs who had no prior background in defense production. That kind of rapid industrial mobilization, drawing on a civilian talent base and repurposing it for wartime production, has historical precedent, most notably in the way entire consumer industries were converted to military production during earlier global conflicts. But the speed at which Ukraine's drone sector has scaled, and the degree to which frontline feedback loops directly and quickly inform new design iterations, appears to be without much precedent. A unit encountering a problem with jamming, with payload weight, with navigation accuracy in poor weather, can, in some cases, see that feedback incorporated into a subsequent production batch within weeks rather than years. This is a fundamentally different tempo of innovation than the one that has traditionally governed defense procurement in large, established militaries, where a new weapons platform might take the better part of a decade to move from concept to fielded unit. That tempo advantage cuts both ways, of course. It means Ukraine can adapt to Russian countermeasures relatively quickly, but it also means that any given generation of drone has a limited shelf life before adversary defenses catch up and force another round of innovation. Russian forces have not stood still in the face of this campaign. They have expanded radar coverage, deployed additional short-range air defense systems around key refineries and industrial sites, and reportedly begun experimenting with their own layered detection networks specifically tuned to catch slow, low-flying, propeller-driven aircraft of exactly the kind Ukraine has been sending across the border. Every strike that succeeds today does so against a defense network that has already adjusted, at least partially, to strikes that succeeded last month. This is very much an ongoing contest rather than a settled outcome, a continuous back and forth between offense and defense that shows no sign of reaching a stable equilibrium anytime soon. It is also worth reflecting on what this campaign reveals about the changing nature of secrecy itself in a modern, highly surveilled world. The soldiers Ronsheimer accompanied went to extraordinary lengths to avoid detection, not through elaborate counter-surveillance technology, but through simple, almost old-fashioned discipline, switching vehicles, using back roads, physically surrendering phones, moving at night. In an age when satellite imagery, cell tower triangulation, and open-source intelligence analysts scouring social media can piece together troop movements from the smallest digital trace, the most effective defense available to a small unit turns out to be the deliberate absence of any digital trace at all. There's something almost paradoxical about a war fought with some of the most advanced long-range unmanned technology available today being protected, at the ground level, by methods that would have been familiar to partisans and resistance fighters generations earlier. The high-tech and the low-tech exist side by side, each compensating for the vulnerabilities of the other. The economic dimension of this story deserves one more layer of consideration because oil and fuel are not simply another line item in a national budget, they are the connective tissue of a modern war effort. Every artillery piece moved to the front, every armored vehicle deployed, every transport aircraft flown, every soldier resupplied, depends at some point on a functioning fuel supply chain. When that chain is disrupted, even partially, the effects ripple outward far beyond the refinery gates. Military logistics units may find themselves competing with civilian demand for a shrinking supply of refined fuel. Domestic price pressures can build even in an economy where prices are heavily managed or subsidized. And export revenue, the hard currency and trade relationships that allow a government to purchase components, pay soldiers, and sustain its broader economy through a prolonged conflict, becomes harder to protect when the very facilities that convert crude oil into exportable and usable products are under repeated attack. This is precisely why energy infrastructure has so often been a primary target in extended wars throughout history, and precisely why Ukraine's planners appear to have concluded that a campaign against refineries offers a more efficient use of limited resources than attempting to match Russia tank for tank or soldier for soldier along a static front line that has barely moved in years. There is finally a question worth asking honestly rather than rhetorically. Where does this lead? Sustained pressure on Russian energy infrastructure is unlikely by itself to force an end to the war, and no serious Ukrainian official has suggested otherwise. Russia possesses substantial reserves, alternative supply routes, and the ability to redirect resources in ways that can partially absorb even a punishing campaign of this scale. But wars are rarely ended by any single decisive factor. They are ended by an accumulation of pressures, military, economic, political, and psychological, that eventually shift a leadership's calculation of what continued fighting is actually worth. A steady stream of fires at refineries thousands of kilometers from the front, fuel queues in towns that had never before felt the war's weight, and the dawning recognition that no depth of Russian territory offers guaranteed safety, all of these things add incrementally to that accumulated pressure. Whether they add enough, and quickly enough, to change the fundamental trajectory of the conflict remains an open question, one that will likely be answered not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow, cumulative arithmetic of nights, very much like the one a German journalist was quietly allowed to witness, somewhere in a dark Ukrainian field, watching a handful of soldiers step back from their machines and watch them disappear one after another into the sky.